So let's talk about a couple examples of some more complex systems. This is not exhaustive. These are not necessarily the most important ones. These are just two examples of more complex systems just to give you a way to think about this. So let's start with biodiversity. Biodiversity is, very simply, this belongs over in the science building with biology. Why are we talking about it over here in history of political science? You only have to take a couple science classes. That's why you're avoiding those till later. Why talk about it now? Well, let's just talk about this. I'm kind of summing up a bunch of different summary or journals and books and things like that, this sort of argument into one. And you kind of saw this in that video about rich biodiversity. So rich biodiversity actually creates a more healthy ecosystem. You saw that in the video. By healthy means it's more resilient, it can withstand shocks. Now what we also know, that's very sciencey, very, here's what I've talked about. I've talked about science stuff. But how does that impact human beings? It turns out that a healthy ecosystem, if you have the healthier the ecosystem, the more human well-being and low poverty you're going to have in that area. And let's just talk about why that's the case. Number one, you're going to have more food and resources. A place that has been sort of, forested out, there's just not the resources around or food around. You also have storm buffers. So when a storm rolls through, there are sort of the ecosystem can absorb some of the impact of this. Just an example of this is the mangroves. I think the mangroves, I want to say, I know this is definitely in South Asia, but I want to say it's in Bangladesh, possibly Burma, I don't really know. But this is a whole series of sort of trees that are at the end of the rivers. And so when a hurricane comes through, the hurricane and the waves tend to hit those trees and not go inland further. But obviously, for a variety of reasons, those trees have been deforested, and now there's very little keeping storm surge from sort of going in further. In general, what we know is this, is that when environmental changes happen, whether it's a climate change or whether it's a hurricane or whether it's a drought or whatever it is, the particular area that has a richer biodiversity, a healthier ecosystem, is more resilient, which means the people there are able to survive better. We also know a few other things about it. So here we have this sort of very direct connection of biodiversity leads to human well-being. So there's a good reason right there to talk about why biodiversity is important. But this is not just a one-way street. It turns out that the human systems also impact the environmental systems. And so we also know through a bunch of other studies is that places that have high income inequality actually lead to low biodiversity. So this actually goes the other way as well. Is human not well-being, low biodiversity. And the reason is just because there's income inequality, there's a lot of poverty, there's not a lot of other places that you can go for food and things, so you end up going and using the trees for firewood, using the local wildlife and plants for food, and essentially sort of using up that area. So we could say, is biodiversity a symptom or a cause of human security? The answer is, again, complexity. The answer is yes. And so, it's not that the biodiversity questions over there are just simply science questions at all. This is one of those things is in college, I'm just going to go off on a thing. At a university, we tend to say, okay, you're going to be this major, you're going to be this major. We're going to make nice different buildings for you, different classes. You're all going to go do very different things, and that's fine. Never will you meet again. And what I think I'm trying to demonstrate with this particular topic today, and really with human security in general, is that if we want the outcomes we want in the world, it's going to require people from all these different majors working together so we can see what the unforeseen consequences are going to be and try to figure out, if I tweak this system, how does this mess with this system over here, and vice versa. That someone who is just doing biology because they care about biodiversity, obviously they can't not care about things like sociology, political science, economics, all that kind of stuff. So this is my point where I say, don't just sort of lock yourself in your own discipline, but think about how these things are interacting with each other. Doesn't mean you have to be an expert in biology, but you can't be ignorant of biology. Here's another example. Back in 2003, there's a guy named Alex DeWall who did these big studies on new variant famines in Africa. So essentially, we know about famines in Africa and how, lack of rain, and then of course climate change, how those affect famine. He was studying a very different kind, a new variant of famine, and it's caused by HIV/AIDS. And what he found is that where there is higher incidence of HIV/AIDS, and Africa has a much higher percent of HIV/AIDS than the rest of the world, you have food shortages. Let's talk about why. Number one, you're going to have labor shortages. People are going to be sick. People are going to die from HIV/AIDS, which means you have fewer people out in the field actually growing food. Now, this is probably not the food that's going to be coming over here to the United States, shipped out like that. It's probably going to be local food, but that's the whole point, is that if food production goes down locally, there's less food. That is, by definition, a famine. Another thing is you're going to have loss of assets and skills. People are going to die younger, which means they're not going to be able to pass those skills on to the next generation, which means the next generation is not going to be vastly improving on agricultural techniques or even necessarily be trained in those things. They're going to be, you sort of lose that, the knowledge base, the skills base. Increased burden of care. So those kids are going to be spending a lot of time taking care of their parents, or the workers will be busy taking care of each other who are sick. And that increased burden of care adds that much more work to do that's not work growing food. And so what we end up seeing, we take all this stuff together, is that's a really important sort of connection between HIV, AIDS, and food shortage. If that was the end of the story, this wouldn't be one of the complexity things. This would just be X causes Y. Here's what we also know, though. If there's a food shortage, that means that people aren't getting enough to eat, which means they're also not getting enough nutrients. Not just calories, but nutrients. Which means that when this happens, the people who are in that area are now more susceptible to disease like HIV/AIDS. So what we find is, this is the complexity idea. HIV is going to lead to malnutrition, which is going to increase the incidence of HIV, malnutrition, and on and on and on. That a lot of famines sort of right themselves because the rain comes along later. This kind of new variant famine creates a huge cycle or poverty trap. The famine produces social changes that increase the transmission of AIDS. So now a lot of these people here can't survive in this area, so they travel to the city, which then brings HIV/AIDS with it to those places as well, and sort of spreads this as well. And so again, it's not just a local thing either, it's a global thing as well. And so this is part of this is, again, I just want to point this out, like, how do you actually end up, let's say that this is the thing you're concerned about, you want to write your policy paper on this. How do you actually break this cycle? Like, where do you step into this vast complexity to write this sort of thing, to end this cycle of famine? All right, I'm really not trying to bring it down. What I'm trying to do, and let me just say this before you go on to the next thing, I want to talk about the complexity and let you know how complex it is and difficult, not so that you say, oh my gosh, I can't do anything about it, but instead to say this, if this is something that you think is bad and injustice in the world, it is a thing worth investing your life in. It's not going to be simple, or if I just tweak this, there's the answer. It's be understanding a whole lot of systems that play a role in these outcomes, in unjust outcomes that if it's worth it to you, it's worth investing your life in. All right, what I'm going to have you do now is I'm going to have you look at a video about some programs in Ghana. These are UN programs in Ghana that are trying to address these sorts of issues while taking into account the complexity, the different systems that are addressing it. So take a look at that.